To succeed and thrive at C-suite level, you need strategic clarity and operational excellence. Hello and welcome to the latest episode of the C-Suite Framework podcast. How are you doing? I hope you're all well. I am just back from 3 fantastic days on the beautiful island of Cyprus. They had their inaugural risk management conference there, organised by AGRC, and I was delivering the keynote. My first time to the island, beautiful, but some really interesting insights from people, particularly in the area of AI fraud prevention and so on. And I'll get around to writing a blog on that at some point, so look out for those insights when they come. Other news for me to report, absolutely thrilled to say since the last podcast, my books have broken through the 40,000 sales barrier. So I'm absolutely made up about that. And thank you to all of you who buy the books, support the books, tell people about the books. It really does make a difference. And that word of mouth piece for both the books and the courses is just what makes it the success that it is. So thank you again so much for that. Speaking of courses, my How to Be a CRO course has launched with Premier. We had the opening launch webinar for that and looking forward to hearing more from the Premier members as time goes by. So today's podcast is with 2 incredibly smart ladies, Alice Driscoll and Louise van Haarst. They are conflict coaches and executive coaches and leadership management coaches. They founded their own consultancy coming out of all of their corporate experience, and they've gone from strength to strength in high demand. And they have co-authored a new book called Smart Conflict. And it's a great listen. I hope you get a lot from it. What I've realized, the more I pass through this earth, the more time I spend, is how I just don't want to spend my time feeling stressed, feeling anxious, dreading conversations with people. I want obviously to work with great people and people where we can create things together. But sometimes, and it's inevitable in working with people, conflicts come along, and they've produced something that I think is going to be helpful to all of us in dealing with those people who just, we rub each other up the wrong way, and finding some ways through that and some ways to have conflict, because conflict is healthy. No conflict is just as bad, actually, as too much. You want constructive, effective, innovative, smart conflict, and you want to be able to do that in a way that's safe and repair the relationship afterwards. And that's what their book is all about. For those of you, I'm sure it's going to be relevant to whatever level you work at, whatever level of seniority, whatever industry you're in. We all have those people in our lives who challenge us, and maybe, just maybe, this might help you a little bit. Let's have a listen. I am delighted to welcome to the podcast Louise van Haarst and Alice Driscoll. Louise and Alice are experienced and in-demand leadership and performance coaches and conflict specialists. They are co-founders of leadership consultancy, The Powerhouse. And with clients from BBC to Accenture, they are trusted by leaders across finance, tech, media, law, and consulting. And Louise and Alice are also co-authors of the newly published book, Smart Conflict: How to Have Hard Conversations at Work. Louise and Alice, welcome to the podcast.
Thank you. Lovely to be here.
So listen, we've met before. We've had some great conversations, but for the benefit of our listeners, maybe Louise, you can kick off. Just tell us a bit about your backstory. I know you came from corporate, you came together. How did it come about? How did you 2 come together?
So we have quite different backgrounds at work, which I think makes what we do today even more kind of relevant and interesting. So I'll let Alice explain her side of the story. But I started off working in the NGO and UK voluntary sector, first of all in an employed capacity, but mostly as a specialist consultant in restructure, strategic mergers, rescue mergers, kind of right sizing and sort of fundraising type emergencies. And as you can imagine, there was a lot of conflict inherently baked into that, sometimes due to the subject matter where it was sort of literally life or death in terms of the subjects we were working on. More often than not, it was sort of the typical cultural things that arise in high pressure situations. And I think in terms of what brings me into the story today and what brought me to Alice, working as a consultant, you have to be a machine pretty much. I had 3 kids very close together. And so doing the lifestyle that I had been doing for all those years wasn't working for me. And I tried to work out what was the bit that I loved, what was the thing that was kind of my own zone of genius. And the bit that I loved and the bit that I seemed to be quite good at was working with the boards, working with the executives and helping them to work out how to say a hard thing, to tolerate saying the thing, to recover from it and move on, and how to do it in a way that landed the impact that they wanted. And I didn't know that that was a career, but somebody told me that there was a thing called executive coaching and you could go and train in it. And so I went to business school to Henley to start off my training. And that is where Alice and I met and kind of discovered that we shared an interest.
I spent a couple of decades working in creative agencies and ad agencies, sort of latterly in leadership roles. And I think one of the big things, of course, was that I was given a leadership coach, and that was a really transformational experience for me. And I remember thinking, wow, that's a job. That's like a dream job. And I want to know everything that my coach knows. Like I will, stay up late and read whatever it is I need to read and do whatever I need to do. So that was kind of how I got introduced to the profession. And actually not dissimilarly to Louise, I think the way I had become known in my own sort of executive reputation was as somebody who made saying hard things okay, and somehow was able to land the difficult messages in a way that, didn't sort of have the negative impact that either other people feared or experienced. And so it sort of became an obvious focus area for me, and a sort of a niche really that kind of ended up growing then in my coaching practice, and then started to work with teams and become particularly interested in the dynamics that were going on between people rather than sort of in the one-to-one work. So yes, Henley was a big part of my sort of desire to just really that inextinguishable thirst for learning, and was fortunate to meet Louise there and meet somebody else who I think fairly unusually had this sort of deep fascination and interest, particularly about tension in dynamics and conflict. So the rest, as they say, is history. And we are now 55,000 words wedded together.
And a thriving consultancy practice as well. I mean, what you have obviously found is that the challenges and the issues and the things that sort of set you alight have also resonated with clients from across a whole range of industries as well. How long have you actually been consulting?
I mean, there are a couple of answers to that. In terms of doing conflict in our individual practices, so I was predominantly kind of one-to-one executive coach, working with leaders. Alice's was a mix of team coaching and one-to-one, but very specialist in team coaching. We were doing that separately for it's been 6 and 10 years. But in terms of coming together and doing this as a business, we only registered the business, I think, about 18 months ago. But we have been absolutely inundated with work since then. And I think one of the reasons for that is this is an evergreen problem. A conflict, which we'll probably talk about in a bit, is inherent to human relationships. It's actually very important that we're able to have conflict because that's where kind of growth often comes from. But I think what we're learning at the moment is that we're in a very particular time in terms of what's going on in kind of the global landscape of work, where this has become so important to solve, and the how do we have hard conversations in a way that are not damaging and aren't going to get us into hot water has become a kind of real burning platform. And I think it's a mixture of luck and judgment. We love this subject and can talk about it until the cows come home, but there seems to be a moment where it's really captured the imagination of our clients and is fulfilling an actual business need to solve.
I was just thinking about one of the things we were reflecting on yesterday on a flight home from one of our more glamorous locations of coaching in Provence. We were really reflecting on the fact that I think one of the things that has meant that I guess that interest hasn't waned, and that usually once we sort of start working with an organization, we end up working with the entire organization, is because one of the things our clients often say to us is your training goes that step further than a lot of other training because you go into the detail of the how. So not conceptually how, but quite literally, let's get the language right. And I think, we know that that's a really big driver of behavior change, is really the minutiae of the interaction and kind of feeling like they have a structure and sets of words that will really guide them to get it right. So that was just something that we were reflecting on yesterday.
No, and it is like your approach is so very practical. And we will get into that in just a second. But also, I mean, one of the reasons I was so keen to have you on this conversation. I mean, Louise, we share a background in the NGO space. You're absolutely right. Like literally, we are talking life and death. We're not talking about losing some money, right? We're talking about people's safety. We're talking about mission. We're talking about things. Of course, people are going to get at times heightened. Of course, emotions and sensitivities and fears are going to be raised. And it's coming from not an absence of caring too much. And, if people need to be able to navigate that. And Alice, I loved what you said. I mean, I think, the sort of radical candor, because I think I'm one of those people as well. I'm a person who gets frustrated in a room or a meeting or whatever when I feel like people aren't saying what they really feel. And I call it out. And it's usually helpful, but there are times definitely when maybe it's been a little bit of a shock to people. And I think you have to find some ways, and you talk about signposting, and we'll get to that, whereby you kind of, I'm just going to do this now. I'm just going to put out, I'm just going to exaggerate to make a point. I'm just going to, and that kind of thing, so that people kind of go, oh, okay, here's where we're going. But I think it's important that you do that. It's important that you break the ice sometimes and get people saying what they really feel. But it's also important to do it in a safe way. But I'm jumping ahead. I'm getting too excited by the content. What I wanted to ask both of you was, I'm so curious as to what is the most common situation that you get called in to diffuse?
We can answer that question directly, but there's a secondary answer to that. So if we're thinking about de-escalation, which is just one half of the work that we do around conflict, there are some very common things that we work on. One of the really common things is co-founder conflict. So where two people have come together to build a business, and it's one of those things, it's a bit like a marriage where you kind of have the honeymoon period and the kind of hope and enthusiasm carries you on. And then the rubber meets the road. And actually we haven't worked out, what do we do when we don't agree on a decision? What do we do when somebody decides that there needs to be a CEO and it has to be them and it's not going to be the other person? So there's those it's almost kind of like those very deep relational things are things where people come for de-escalation. I'll let Alice speak to that because she's done a lot of work in the kind of mediation and de-escalation space. But I think one of the things to land in this conversation and in general is, I say 80% of the work that we do is the other way around, is to help cultures and teams where there is an enforced harmony, where the rules are that we sort of agree and we don't say hard things to each other, but then the back channels and the side conversations and the side deals are done out of the room, is to help them work out how to have that healthy conflict in the room together rather than pretend everything is okay, which of course everybody knows it's not. And that's part of the reason that we decided that we needed to create a model and write 55,000 words on the subject, is because people were not able to realize they needed that conflict in the room. What would you say, Alice?
Yeah, absolutely. So I think about kind of in more enterprise kind of businesses, the most common things would be, we'll come into a leadership team, a senior team where you've got two extremely high performers, but the level of collaboration has got to the point where it's really impacting the whole team's performance. And you've got a CEO or a team leader or an MD going, they're both brilliant in their own functions, but as a team, we can't call this high performance. And it's got to a point now where it can't be ignored. We've probably ignored it for too long. So that's probably the most typical scenario that we would see, which is that kind of siloed excellence, but not really looking at kind of like the team ability.
I was about to ask, but I think you've answered it, Alice. It sounds like sometimes you get brought in probably a little later than you would have liked, that it would have been maybe easier if you could have been brought in earlier in the conflict and maybe de-escalate, but you still go in. And it sounds like from what you said in the book, the vast majority of the time you are successful, even when it's gone quite far, in de-escalating that.
Yeah. So how we would define success, because I think, what we're not saying is that 2 years into a deep conflict or rift and death by 1,000 cuts, that you can go in for a day and then they sort of skipping away best friends. But what absolutely is possible is to move something forward, because the thing that, I think is so difficult is that people just get completely stuck and there's this standoff. And no one knows how to kind of get unstuck. So what we specialize in is getting unstuck. Now, getting unstuck might be that one of those people decides to move on. But what we can do is get to a decision and get to forward motion. More often than not, and in surprisingly entrenched conflicts, nonetheless, you do often get to a point where both are happy to stay and they find a new way of working. But of course, we get brought in late because what happens at first is that, firstly, everyone's in denial, both the individuals involved and the team around them. Then everyone's aware there's a problem, but they just hope that time will heal. And we always say time does not heal, time hardens. And then once that, so the first bit takes 3 to 6 months, then the second bit takes 3 to 6 months, and then they try and do things themselves, right? So HR maybe try to get involved very reluctantly for very good reasons. Maybe the managers and the CEO themselves try to kind of just say, can't you just sort this out? So they try a number of kind of internal interventions. So of course we're last resort, and it makes sense because I think it feels like a big decision in terms of the signaling to bring somebody external in, especially if it's not kind of the norm and it's positioned as a sort of last resort rather than a lubricant of sorts, I guess, that could be kind of used earlier. So of course it's better to address things earlier. Of course you're going to have better results if you go in earlier. That's not the reality of when we normally brought in. So we're used to dealing with pretty entrenched conflicts, and that's why the goal really is forward motion and getting it unstuck. And that can look like a number of different results.
So let's talk a little bit about how you get unstuck and about the framework that you deploy, because we all love a framework. And yours is a 5 R's framework. And obviously, we're not going to do justice to everything that you have in the book, but maybe just for our listeners, just give them a flavor about how you go about it.
So the 5 R's, I'll give you a very quick outline, and then we can maybe talk about a couple that you found particularly interesting. So the first one is reflection. So this is about reflecting on your own conflict settings. So we will instinctively know that there is a way that we tend to show up in certain scenarios, and we can choose to show up differently. But if we're surprised into it, we all have our own default. So reflecting on that, and then knowing that that is true, reflecting on how other people tend to show up in relation to us or into relation to a subject, and what clues that can give us about the strategy we're going to take to make sure that we're going into it in a good place, but we're setting up the conversation for success. So first of all, we'll reflect on that. The second, which is very deeply linked to that, is regulation. How we show up in a conversation profoundly and directly influences how another person shows up. So the more regulated we are, the more calm, graceful, prepared we are to kind of go in and respond thoughtfully rather than react from that kind of fight, flight or freeze place, the better chance we have of, one, using the strategy we had on our minds for the conversation, but two, we're not going to trigger the other person into a threat response or trigger them into something unhelpful. Readiness is the third one. So we're thinking about quite literally being ready with the words that we're going to use, the how and where is this conversation going to take place to best result, and how are we going to be incredibly clear about what it is that we want to land, the impact we want to have, the action we want to see, and how we know that the other person has heard exactly what we intended. Because as we know, the biggest problem in communication is the illusion that it's taken place. So, but really getting very granular about that strategy. The first 3 we can do in advance. The fourth is response. So this is the first thing we can't plan. What are we going to do if we show up and the other person reacts badly? They get angry, they cry, we get angry, we cry. Something unexpected is said that takes the conversation in a completely different direction. And what we have observed many times is that, one, the fear of somebody else's response is what stops us having the conversation in the first place. But also the idea that we won't know what to do, or actually in actual fact not knowing what to do and getting it wrong, has got us results that we didn't want. So the anxiety of not knowing how to respond can be a problem before, during, and indeed after the conversation, when you realise you've done something you didn't intend. So in the book and in our training, we talk about how can you prepare for anything, and how can you ensure that at all points you're able to make a choiceful response in that moment, even if it's to stop the conversation, gracefully exit, go away and think about approaching it again. Because just because you've decided you're going to have it doesn't mean it's the right time. And then very much related to that, the last one, and potentially the most important one, is the concept of repair. So if we get into a conflict at work, even one that's smart and healthy, we might have had to say something difficult the other person did not receive well. And that will have done some damage to the relationship, which we call a rupture. And it can be very small. I could feel slighted. I could feel a little bit annoyed with you. Or it could be quite large. Maybe we've had quite an unpleasant conversation where things were said which were not acceptable, and sort of anything in between. So, but what we can always do, whatever's happened in that conversation, is make an active repair. We can go back and say, that was hard, but we're okay. Or I really got that wrong and I need to apologize. Can we do it again? I think one of the things that we're noticing that is most transformational of our clients is they don't even think about the possibility of doing that. For one, they think, oh, it's too late. It's all lost. Whereas we know that you can do that in almost all cases. Some kind of repair can be made. And what they also don't realize is that it's a work of moments often. And the more you're doing it in those moments, the higher trust relationship you have. So actually conversations don't feel as hard.
I mean, not wanting to jump to the end, but the rupture to repair ratio was something I had never thought about before. And so what you say in the book was you should be, and maybe culturally there are some differences here as well, but in general, you should be looking at a sort of a 5-to-1 repair to rupture ratio. So for every one rupture that you have, you should be looking to have about 5 opportunities to rebuild trust, to soften and everything else. And I probably, and maybe lots of people are guilty about this, I probably thought it was 1-to-1, as in like something happened, I'll do something and, that should be it. And not thinking about, oh my God, yeah, 5-to-1, right? And it's a little bit like positive to negative feedback, isn't it? That's usually about like 7-to-1 or something like that. So that is something that I had never thought about before and something that I would seek to do in future.
It's something that really lands with our kind of workshop participants in the way that it's landed with you, because I think that's it. Most people think it's 1-to-1. And it makes sense, doesn't it? Because if you think you've just kind of had a bit of a sticky interaction with somebody, at home or at work, imagine that they then sort of complimented you on your contribution to something later on. Would you be ready for another sticky conversation right the next morning? You wouldn't, would you? It does take, and I think we think it's time, but it's actually not about time. It's about what happens in the time. And so we talk about it as a kind of this relational bank account, and for every interaction being a credit or a debt. And so that's that 5-to-1. You want to be making 5 credits for every debt. And look, that's not every conversation or every day, but it's about thinking about it over the course of the dynamic, over the course of the relationship. So there are times where we're over-indexing on sticky conversations, but then we might go for a couple of months where there isn't one, and we can like really, really kind of fill that bank account. So yeah, I think it's a super useful thing to just know is a truth about how we all are.
And of course, it's got to be done authentically. It's got to be done from a place of goodwill. We're not talking about fawning or gestures and that kind of thing here, but, talking about, but finding a way to, in a big way or a small way, just signal goodwill between the two of you and do something.
It's interesting, isn't it? In terms of the authenticity piece, it's quite nuanced because yes, we will say don't make up, don't pretend somebody's made a great contribution in a meeting if you genuinely don't think they haven't. But most of us are sitting on quite a lot of compliments that we just don't share. So firstly, there's the practice of going, well, have you ever had we have had some clients say to us, I haven't been brought up this way. We didn't do compliments in our family. It was like the bare minimum is if it's going well, you won't hear from me, and then, but I'll be sure to let you know if there's something I'm not happy about. And we do work with clients, both, 1-to-1, but also in groups and teams who will say, literally, what do I do? And I say, well, because the thought of saying something inauthentic does feel wrong. And that is right to an extent. But find those real thoughts that you've never thought of articulating and just start there. And just think to yourself at the end of every day, if you find this hard, what's something that person did really well today, or I'm grateful for about that person in general? So if they left the team, what would I miss if I really, sometimes you have to dig deep for this, but there's hopefully there's something. And if the answer is nothing, then I think you've got another problem on your hands. But there is that. But the other piece of the puzzle is in terms of authenticity is, if you're not used to doing it, it might land a bit inauthentically if you suddenly turn up in a kind of whole new different way. And that's where signposting can come back in really usefully, which is, look, everybody, I'm going to be making an effort to be like this a bit more. Or sometimes some of our clients, would feel comfortable to say, I've been on a course, so bear with me because I'm going to be trying some stuff out. But actually, at least you're preparing people for a change and they're not thinking, what on earth is going on here? New things, new behaviors, new skills do feel inauthentic at first, but we've got to hold on to this idea that we're always becoming, and learning new skills cannot be thought of as inauthentic. Otherwise, we're really, really holding ourselves back.
I don't think I have ever regretted, and I've certainly, the older I've got, the more experience I've got. I really try, if something comes to my mind, and it could be passing someone in the street and going, I really like your boots, or something like that. I don't think I've ever regretted paying someone a compliment. Worst case, they might ignore you or brush it off and that kind of thing. Most cases, the vast majority, they're going to go, oh, thanks. And if someone says that to you, or said like, I really appreciated your perspective in that meeting. I appreciated that you said what nobody else was prepared to say, or whatever it was, or what, I just brought you a coffee, and that kind of, so all those little things like it's once you start doing it, it's not hard, and it is very rare that you will regret doing it, in my experience.
Yeah. And in terms of culture change, and we're kind of coming at it at that kind of leadership kind of macro lens, is that all culture change comes through individuals changing their behavior. So there is an element in even what you say about giving a compliment. We witnessed it on the plane last night coming back from Nice, that one of our people in the cabin opposite us made quite a big effort to help me put my suitcase away by inconveniencing himself, by getting his bag down and putting it away and putting mine up. And we were obviously very genuinely grateful to him. But it was such a lovely thing. And I think I said, and then later you said, gosh, that's so kind. Thank you so much for putting yourself out. And then what I noticed throughout the flight was then other people started being a bit more generous. And it kind of he had created an atmosphere of generosity and politeness around him. That's known as emotional contagion. And we see that in the research around culture changes. If you're showing up in a warm and relational way, and you're not being inauthentic, but you're doing what you do, just very naturally, just being warm, signaling warmth and liking, that becomes contagious in a very positive way. So it's a bit beyond modeling. Yeah, you are modeling, but it does something to our nervous systems because we're kind of reading each other, and you sort of unconsciously it becomes contagious. You're like, oh, that's a really lovely way to show up. So although it could sound quite fluffy, I think if we bring it back to thinking about culture change, it's essential that we're doing those kind of individual moments.
In my books, I write that sort of culture is, yes, it's some of the big totemic things that leadership does at the top of the organization, right? Sometimes it's a big decision that people make and it signals the values and the virtues of the organization. But it's also the little micro everyday interactions. It's holding the door for someone. It's bringing someone into a meeting who maybe hadn't been speaking. I remember in my NGO setting, because people were sort of saying, oh, when is our culture change transformation going to happen? And I was like, right now, with how we are with each other. It's not a matter of waiting for something to happen. It's like we make it happen in what we do. This podcast is brought to you by the best-selling How to Be A range of books. These books, authored by me, Jennifer Geary, in collaboration with other seasoned experts, break down roles such as the COO, Chief Risk Officer, Chief People Officer, and Chief Sustainability Officer into their component parts. They explain the technical capabilities you need, but also how to operate at this level, preparing yourself, getting to know your peers, engaging with culture, strategy, building your team, and much more. Over 30,000 books have been sold, and the books have received overwhelmingly positive reviews. There's even a book about the role of AI called The Augmented COO. Check out the books, available on Amazon and Waterstones now. One of the distinctions that you draw, and again, I just found this really thoughtful, was between what you call relational conflict and task conflict. Alice, do you want to just break down what those two differences are?
Yeah, absolutely. So there's two types of conflict. One we want more of, and one we really do want to address and transform if we have a lot of it in our organization. So the kind of conflict that we think of and probably comes to mind when we hear the word conflict and we think about sort of toxic workplaces, whatever that might mean to anybody, that probably means there's a high amount of relational conflict going on in that team or in that organization. So that's the kind of conflict where we're really thinking about who's right, who's wrong. Like a game of singles tennis, it's you versus me. And this is really about kind of ego and status, and a sense that if I'm wrong, I'm not good enough and I'm going to be undervalued here in my role. So it's maybe it's my job to be an expert. And so if I don't know the answer, what will that mean for me and for how I'm kind of viewed and valued here? So we can really easily get into this game of who's right and who's wrong. Analogy, which actually one of our clients brought to us, of this single games of tennis is very useful, because then when we think about the kind of conflict that actually all the research tells us is a brilliant thing to have lots of in the workplace, is task conflict. So that's where we're debating and disagreeing about what is the right decision for the task, for the program, for the project, for the team, for the organization. And that's where we want lots of dissenting views, and we want people to have really to bring perspective with confidence, but to remain open to changing their minds. So in task conflict is depersonalized. I'm bringing what I know, what I see, what I think, what I feel. I want to hear what you're bringing, because it's only when we put the whole picture together that we can together collaboratively look at the best solution for this problem. So we like to think about this as a game of doubles, where it's you and me versus the problem on the other side of the net. And a lot of the work we do is help people to know in the moment of conversation, how do you meet a relational conflict and take it into the task conflict space? So how do we think about, rather than throwing the problem back and forth? And the simplest way to do that is to just define together what is the shared problem right now. And often the starting point for that is we appear not to agree on X. So how are we together going to come up with the right process or plan for finding a way through this? So it's a really, really large part of our smart conflict kind of methodology.
So, relational conflict, you versus me, zero-sum game. I win, you lose, you win, I lose. There's only space for one of us type thing. Whereas task conflict is we're in this together. This is the problem. It's really hard. What you provide in the book is actual sentences that we can use, which I just find so, so it's kind of like, I think we can agree that this is a problem. Now, maybe where we're disagreeing is on what the root cause is or where we go from here and that kind of thing, but we're in this together to solve it. And being equipped with some of those words and coming from that shared place of trust, I think is potentially transformational for people who are stuck in conflict. I'm going to ask a tough question. You encourage, right from the beginning of the book, you encourage us to approach tough conversations and conflict with hope. What happens when you're genuinely across the table from someone who has malintent? A political actor, someone whose agenda is not aligned with your own, someone who's trying to take you down. You're never going to get there. Is it naive in that situation to assume positive intent? What advice do you have in that situation?
So I'll start, if that's okay, Alice, and then I'm sure we will riff and build on our thoughts on this because we haven't spoken about it in advance. So I think there's a couple of things to say. I think coming from the angle where we come at is being smart. So we're thinking, what is the smartest way to approach a situation at any time? Often the smartest thing to do is know that we can't read the other person's mind. So we might have a hypothesis that there is malintent, but we don't have enough evidence, or we could be over-interpreting. So it's like that kind of thing. It's like go in with multiple hypotheses. I think there might be some malintent. I actually think there is some political moves here and something else is going on the surface. But I'm going to choose in this moment to assume positive intent. I'm going to go in open-minded and warm and relational, and I'm going to see what greets me. And what we would say is you can choose to have positive intent until the evidence is telling you that that is not a great strategy. That is not smart to continue with that assumption because it appears that your assumption is incorrect. And that could be because of how they're behaving. It could be some literal data that comes across. It could be that just your instinct is so deep, now you've given the opportunity to kind of explore where they're coming from, that actually they're not acting in your best interests. Then we will choose a different strategy. And then we'll begin to think, what's my next move in this relationship to get it into a task ideally if we can, or to keep myself safe until such time as that I can think about what my next move is. So there are definitely times, Jenny, where it would be 100% naive to assume that everybody always means well. But I think what we know from working with a lot of teams, and when you do those kind of one-to-one interviews before you get into the teams, you can hear somebody has formed a really strong hypothesis about what's going on in somebody else's mind. And these are confidential conversations, so they're quite open with us. So you hear the story from one perspective, and then you meet the other person who has no malintent at all. They're just kind of doing their best. They've misunderstood something. Their level of professional maturity is lower. Perhaps the other person is a bit threatened by them. And you can see there isn't any malintent. And so I think there are times when we are correct in our mind reading and our hypotheses that somebody means us ill, but a lot of the time we're wrong. So where we need to be curious and assume positive intent until such times that is no longer a smart thing to do. What would you say, Alice?
I would say all of that. And I would say, I think malintent is less common than we think. So what we notice is that when we go in, it's everybody's default that malintent is at play. And it's rarely what we end up discovering together with them. It's usually not that, but I think it's a really natural human default to think that that's what's happening. So I think it's worth, as Louise said, really just checking in on that first and going, what's leading me to believe this? And to just remain hopeful and open-minded initially in order to be super smart. And I think the other thing to say is that there are a couple of very specific, powerful questions that you can ask people that will give you a kind of unequivocal understanding of their position. And one of those is, what is not going to work is to go in and say, do you have malintent? Are you just trying to take me down? Because most people who are political players will not admit to showing their hand. But you can say, let's say it's showing up around a disagreement and you're not getting alignment on something that you need to move forward. You can say something along the lines of, is there anything that I could say or do that would open your mind to a different way forward on this? And that's very specific, right? And so if you hear no, probably not worth putting your energy or your hope into thinking that you're going to get anywhere with this, but at least you know where you stand. And then they're forced to really think. And if they do say, well, actually, if you brought me a piece of data on X, or if John agreed, I'd rethink. At least you know where to put your energy. Whether you agree with it or not is another thing.
What's nice about that question is it's inviting the other person to try and help you solve, to see again, if you have that kind of, can we be on the same side of the net, in tennis, and is there any willingness on your part to be there? And again, what I like about this is it equips you with a way of exhausting all the other possibilities before you, if indeed then you do conclude, okay, this is just a failed, there's no trust, there's no point in continuing further here. At least you've exhausted all the different options.
The only other thing I would say as well that maybe just is worth saying explicitly is we can only have a good relationship with somebody who wants to have a good relationship with us. So, there is that kind of truth and reality here, which is, and in conflicts, both people have to want to solve it for that to work. So that one of the prerequisites that we have for working with any kind of two execs, for example, who are causing problems is we'll speak with them each individually and say, what does good look like here? And if one of them is like, I see a 0% chance of this turning around, and frankly, I don't even want this to get better, we wouldn't work with them, because basically, I think what we do in that kind of pre-chat is go, we're looking for the hope, because there has to be some hope on both sides in order for anything to be able to move forward.
And I was going to say, one of the other R's, as well as the repair, the one that I really liked was the regulate, because conflict is hard and tough, and that pounding heartbeat and that feeling in your stomach and that stress response that you have is, deeply unpleasant. And I'm sure there are people listening to the podcast right now who experience this, on maybe even on a regular basis and that kind of thing, and finding a way to just regulate and take a little bit of the heat and the discomfort out of that situation so that you can take a pause. And again, I love the possibility of kind of saying, oh, I didn't expect this to go this way. I didn't expect the conversation to go this way. I need to think about this. I need, can we come back tomorrow? Can we take a range, whatever it is, and to allow that kind of discomfort to just pass a little bit, because it's horrible. We've all had it, and it's really not something that you want to be experiencing, not least just the cortisol levels and everything that you experience when that happens.
Yeah, and I don't know if you've read The Chimp Paradox, Jenny, by Steve Peters, this amazing book about how our amygdala works, that fight, flight or freeze response. And he gives it a name. He calls it our inner chimp. And he talks about when you get into that fight freeze, particularly fight, your chimp comes out and the chimp starts fighting. And what is quite dangerous for you is if you are a very nice, well-meaning person who is triggered into their chimp kind of entering the room and the chimp starts fighting and the chimp is causing chaos, you're not in control. It's the chimp is in control. And God forbid somebody else's chimp is triggered to come out. And then it's both your nervous system response is fighting. And it's such a powerful image because if we've ever seen people really go for each other from almost 0 to kind of 100, that is because of that amygdala hijack and those kind of inner chimps coming out. What is really transformational for a lot of people who struggle to self-regulate is to realize that you can control that. It's not necessarily your personality. You might be set a little bit more reactively than the average, but you can still learn to control that by regulating yourself, by calming your nervous system, and then you choose what you do. I think the thing that people get really scared of is they have no choice, or they think this is who I am. I'm just very reactive, but you do have control over that.
Yeah, or they fear they'll lose their edge. And it's actually the opposite. If you're a hard-driving, passionate person, you'll still have that, but you will be more effective in your engagement with other people, just that little bit more regulated.
And that's the fascinating thing of working with aggressive people one-to-one is absolutely, it's worked for them incredibly effectively until it doesn't. And that's sometimes the thing we spend ages on is the why. Like, this works for me. Like, it works for me to be really hard driving. It works for me to not suffer fools gladly. And we're like, but in what way does it not work? What's the downstream effect? And what prizes are you not going to get? Because the way you're showing up is actually now having a bigger impact on your potential and performance in the future.
There's so much that's brilliant in the book. I mean, I took other notes and we won't go into it all now, but things like there's a projection tool where you can kind of project how the other person is feeling. There's curious questions, which I absolutely love. And there's something called tactical empathy that you talk about as well. But, I won't spoil it for readers. But just before we wrap up, I mean, I guess what's the reaction been to the book so far? What have people been saying to you?
I think we've been really overwhelmed with the reaction on a few levels. One, it's quite an odd experience the first time you realize that it's gone beyond your own network. And so we've had people getting in touch saying that it's been selected for kind of international book groups who read business books and things. And I'll message Louise and say, do you know this person? And she's like, no. And we're like, wow. So I think there's a sense of, you always think, oh, well, maybe just your friends and family will support you. But it really has kind of taken on a bit of a life of its own, which has been enormously rewarding. And also, I think we have written it as a field guide for busy people with the expectation that they might sort of just dip in and out or go to the bit that was most relevant. But a bit like you were saying, Jenny, at the beginning, I think we've been amazed how many people have messaged us to say they've picked it up, thought, well, I'll start having a go. And then they've ended up reading it cover to cover, which is by no means necessary, but I think, is a glowing endorsement for how hopefully readable and accessible it is, whilst also not sort of skirting all the academic references and the evidence base that kind of sits behind everything. So I think we just could not be more pleased with the reception.
I think the life of its own it's taken and all the places it's gone and all the, some of the book groups have got 2,500 members who are doing a read along, which is amazing to us. But I think the other thing which is very reassuring is what we intended is that the clients and big cohorts from kind of client organizations are reading the book or we're kind of giving them a book as part of the program. And the feeling that this is exactly what we need now, or this is exactly what I needed to give me what I wanted to move forward, because we wrote it to solve a problem, which our clients kept saying to us, is there a book? Is there something I can go and watch? What can I, like, this is great in this session, but what can I go and how can I pass it on to other people? And we're like, there are a few things, but there isn't really anything. So we wrote the thing that our clients were asking for. And we're very relieved to hear that we seem to have fulfilled that brief.
No, there is, and we talked about this when you were embarking on your book journey, and I think I probably said to you that, there's nothing like the experience of someone you've never met, messaging you and going, thank you, you really helped me. And I know lots of people are going to reach out to you for this book. I know from my own perspective, I've realized, life is too short to spend your life in a feeling of heightened stress, of anxiety, of dreading having a meeting with someone, of dreading walking into a room with someone, knowing you're not at your best self, right? And just absolutely knowing the two of you could do so much better if you had a way of navigating around it. So I think the book is already flying. I think it's going to continue to fly. Smart Conflict, How to Have Smart Conversations at Work by Alice Driscoll and Louise van Haarst. Ladies, thank you so much for joining the podcast and the very best of luck with it.
Thank you for such an interesting conversation, Jenny.
We hope you enjoyed the podcast. For more information about the How to Be a books, the C-Suite Framework courses, the podcast, or to get in touch with me, head over to www.csuiteframework.com.